Hey everyone, it's Chrono from the Headphone Show. Today with me I have the HDA20, which is a dynamic driver headphone designed for reference listening, and it's also Sennheiser's closed back take on their own HDA100S. So have they succeeded in making a closed back version of their legendary flagship headphone? Let's find out. Going over the basics first, the HDA20 builds upon the HDA100S's design by creating an enclosure that fits glass covers on Sennheiser's ring radiator driver. Now, these glass covers are visually striking, but more importantly, they're the acoustic component around which the HDA20's closeback design revolves. So, the idea behind this implementation is that the concave glass covers reflect sound waves from the rear of the driver towards absorbers that eliminate resonances, which should make this sound less like a closed back headphone and more like an open back one. Included in the HDA20's ridiculously large packaging, you'll find that you get, of course, the HDA20, an instruction manual USB flash drive, as well as 3 different cables. All 3 cables use a fabric coating, measure 3 meters in length, and use dual-sided ODU connectors for the headphone side. The only difference between them is the termination for the amplifier side. One of them has a 1/4-inch single-ended termination, and the other 2 are XLR and 4.4mm balanced. Moving on to build quality and comfort, the HDA20's design is in large part identical to that of the HDA100S, with the only difference being that Sennheiser has enclosed the rear of the driver. Despite being composed almost entirely out of plastic, the build feels solid and well refined. None of the moving parts feel loose, and I have not heard any creaking. Overall, I feel like the HDA20 is very structurally sound and does not feel like it would have any quality issues down the line. However, there is one element in this design that I do have a really big problem with: the ODU connector jacks on the HDA20 itself. I don't like to admit it, but I did have an accident with an HDA100S where the entire socket assembly came right off when I tried detaching the cable from the headphone. And this is because the socket design that Sennheiser went with here for the HDA100S as well as the HDA20 is very poor. It's just held in slightly by friction as well as by some very thin cables that connect it to the driver. So when you combine that with the ODU connectors, which actually fit very tightly inside the jack, they almost feel like they're locked in, it makes it very easy to just pull apart the entire assembly if you're not careful when detaching the connectors. So I hope that in future revisions of these headphones, if there are any, I hope that Sennheiser does introduce some kind of reinforced design for the jacks just to prevent users like myself from tearing the headphone apart. For comfort, the HDA20 is, like the HDA100S, one of the most comfortable headphones I've had the opportunity to wear. For their size, they're remarkably lightweight at only 360 grams, which is only 30 grams heavier than the HDA100S. The ear cups are extremely spacious, and because the pads on the HDA20 are thicker than on the HDA100S, it's even less likely that your ears will come in contact with the driver. For me, this headphone is one that easily disappears when wearing and remains very comfortable even in day-long listening sessions. So we finally get to talk about how these sound, and there are certain aspects of the HDA20 sonic performance that have really impressed me because they seem to overcome a lot of the drawbacks that I associate with closed back headphones. And at least for me, these still display a lot of the technical characteristics of the HDA100S. As I will share briefly though, there were also very clearly some pretty drastic concessions made, particularly in frequency response and tonality, in order to maintain that level of technical performance. So let's see how they stack up. Let's start by talking about the bass. So whereas the bass region could come across as lean or somewhat sterile on the HDA100S, I actually find it to be very warm on the HDA20. So compared to the HDA100S, the HDA20 has a very good level of presence in the sub-bass region. And I find that its bass shelf under 100 Hz, it's set to a very similar level to that suggested by the 2018 Harman Target curve. I will note though that this sub-bass presence is subject to fit and seal, as in my experience I found that When I put on the HD820 in a position that was just even very slightly off, a lot of the sub bass would go away. And I imagine that for users wearing eyeglasses, this effect is further amplified. Moving closer to the mid bass, there is a very big rise there at around 150 Hz that did make the bass sound just a little bit bloated to me. However, it wasn't a particularly wide bump. It was actually very narrow, so I didn't hear any sort of bleed from the upper bass into the lower mids. And I do think that some listeners will actually enjoy and appreciate the added warmth as well as fullness that rise introduces in this region of the frequency response. The only quirk I really heard for the bass on the HD820 is that there was this strange dip at around 70 Hz that made the bass occasionally sound a little bit disjointed, but altogether I think that the bass response tuning on the HD820 is actually more enjoyable than on the HD800S, as it isn't as thin and it does have a fair bit more extension. Lastly, for detail on the bass, the HD820, like the HD800S, I don't feel like it's quite as articulate or as well textured as some other headphones. It doesn't strike me as having the same level of tightness and control that headphones like the Focal Clear, LCD-X, and Head Audio headphone have for the bass. Now let's talk about the HD820's mid-range. So I tend to associate Sennheiser headphones with having amazingly tuned mids. After all, the HD600 series is constantly praised for its remarkably accurate mid-range, and the HD800S is also generally agreed to be very faithful in its reproduction of the mid-range. Unfortunately, I don't think I can say the same for the HD820. This headphone's mid-range come across to me as really strange, and I think it's definitely what throws off this headphone's tonality and timbre the most. So there seems to be a lack of tonal richness that is derived from a pretty severe dip at around 250 to 300 Hz that takes away a lot of the body away from vocals as well as from other instruments, of which fundamental tones lie in those really low registers of the mid-range. And this dip is only made more apparent by an elevation actually that follows it at around 1000 Hz, which accentuates some of the overtones in the mid-range unnaturally and makes vocals in particular come across as somewhat nasally, at least to me. And then there's also this fairly wide recession centered at around 4K in the upper mid-range that made the mids overall come across as fairly dark and lacking in presence. Now, for internal resolution and overall sense of clarity in the mids, I feel like the HD820 offers fantastic performance. In this regard, I think it actually gets astonishingly close to the HD800S's level of performance. I even think that it slightly outperforms some already exceptionally resolving headphones like the LCD-X and Focal Clear. However, for me at least, I do feel like the really poor balance it has in the mids, as well as that sort of congested, hollowish, dark tonality, I feel like those really overshadow its highly resolving qualities. Lastly, we have the treble range, which I don't have much to say about because I actually find it to be really good on the HD820. It has a very good tuning that's very well balanced. With the HD800 and HD800S, there were peaks at 6 and 10K that could prove themselves to be a little bit bothersome, but that was not the case at all with the HD820. The treble here is actually a fair bit smoother. If there's one complaint, is that there did seem to be, at least to me, a bit of a shout or forwardness at 5K, but it was really extremely minor, and overall the tuning here is just fantastic. Resolution again is really good, especially when you consider that it's a close back. I think that it gets, again, remarkably close to the HD800S's level of detail retrieval, and I think that it's able to actually compete with some of the open backs between $1,500 and $2,000. So yeah, I think that the treble range here is great. Okay, so let's move along now to soundstage imaging and layering. And if there's one quality that the HD800 series has always received quite a bit of praise for, is its soundstage, and thankfully that remains a fairly impressive quality on the HD820. So I think this was expected, but it's not quite as spacious as the HD100S, but it still has some very impressive spatial quality, especially when you consider that it's a closed back headphone. So for Soundstage width, this is actually a very roomy headphone. I actually think that this is slightly wider than something like an LCD-X, definitely much wider than things like the Focal Clear as well as the EtherFlow 1.1. So for just Soundstage width alone, I think that this performs extremely well. And then it also has fantastic imaging. It's very precise, it's very accurate in discerning the positioning and directionality of sound. So these actually are really fun to play with. Not that you'd buy these for gaming, but you know, just thought I'd mention it. Then it also seems to have retained the HD100S's fantastic instrument separation. So all the different instrument and vocal lines are distinguished extremely well from each other, and it's just really easy to track all the different parts that make up complex musical passages on this headphone. So yeah, I think that hands down, I'd have to say that from all the closed back headphones that I've listened to, this one undoubtedly has the best soundstage out of all. As for dynamics, this is a category where the HDA20 performs really poorly. So despite feeling a little bit weightier in the lows, thanks to its elevated bass response, the HDA20, like the HDA100S, is still seriously lacking in excursive force. Now, it does have a nice sense of speed as well as a good top and snap, but if you're looking for a headphone with a really good sense of punch and slam, or a headphone that delivers a satisfying physical impact, then I don't think that the HDA20 will be the headphone for you, as I really don't think that it's able to deliver that. Okay, so before heading into the EQ section and the conclusion to this video, I thought I'd quickly touch up on sound isolation, given that this is a closed back headphone, so that should be one of its main features. But if I'm being honest, it wasn't super impressive on these. Yes, like I heard, like if my computer fans were going crazy and I was using these as my desktop headphone, I didn't hear that stuff. I didn't notice it as much, or like I didn't hear my smashing of my keyboard keys as I try to get more cast out in World of Warcraft. But it really wasn't, like there wasn't as much sound attenuation coming from the outside when compared to some open back headphones. I know it varies depending on which headphone we're talking about, but it never really felt as though I was using a closed back headphone, really. And then the other thing is that these actually leak out quite a bit of sound. So I got a lot of complaints from people on Discord, like they would hear my music coming through the microphone. So my guess is that if people are 2 to 3 feet away from you, they will be able to make out what you're listening to, even if it sounds a little bit muffled. So all in all, I'd still say that this is definitely a stay-at-home listening sort of headphone, and I mean they're pretty bulky anyways. I don't think you'd like to take these out. So yeah, so isolation's a little bit disappointing for a closed back. I don't think it's quite there. Okay, so for EQ, unfortunately, as I mentioned earlier, the HD820 is a headphone that is a little bit on the funky side, particularly around the mid-range. So I do think that it's a headphone that requires EQ, or at the very least greatly benefits from it. So I made an EQ profile for it that focuses mainly on the mid-range, and I do feel like after using that EQ, it does pretty much get rid of most of the issues almost completely that I had with the mid-range. So that kind of hollowness, the nasaliness, as well as the darkness that was there in the mids, it's gone. Also, I do adjust the bass a bit to my preference. I prefer a more Harman style bass response with less warmth, so I do add a fairly large cut in the mid bass at around 150 hertz. So if you'd like to try that out, my EQ profile for it, there's gonna be a link in the description down below to a post I've made in the Headphones community forums that is basically just a compilation of all my EQ presets for all the different headphones that I've reviewed. So if you're interested in checking that out, links in the description down below. Okay, so now to wrap up this review. I think that the HD820 is an impressive headphone, and it's one that I personally enjoyed after EQ, but if I'm being honest, I still feel like this is more of a proof of concept of what an HD800S that's closed could be like. I mean, sure, it literally is a closed back HD800S, but in its current design implementation, I feel like it sees way too many compromises over the HD100S without fully realizing any of the versatility or convenience benefits that are usually attached with going with a closed back. I think that if Sennheiser further developed this glass and sound wave absorption closed back design, and was able to create an iteration that did not require EQ whilst also improving isolation, I do think that this would be one of the top headphones out there. But as it stands today, there really are no benefits, and actually I think that there's only trade-offs really when going from the HD100S to the HD820. So I really struggle to find any scenario where I would find myself choosing or recommending the HD820 over the HD800. Anyways, that is all for me today. I hope you enjoyed this video or found it useful. If you did, do consider dropping a like. If you'd like to learn more about the Sennheiser HD820 or other headphones, I highly encourage you to check out the review section available on headphones.com. For more headphone audio content, stay tuned to The Headphone Show. Until next time, this is Chrono signing off.